Hello to everyone tuning in to today's webcast, brought to you by the Cloud Standards Customer Council. My name is Tracy Berardi. I'm Program Manager of the CSCC. We have just finished and released version 3 of our seminal guide, The Practical Guide to Cloud Computing. This paper was first published back in 2011, just a few short months after the creation of the Council. It's quite comprehensive, and we've just updated it. It contains a 10-step roadmap to guide you towards the successful deployment of cloud computing applications. The paper has been updated to contain new standards, technologies, and references throughout the document. So today we'll walk you through it. And for those of you who are perhaps new to the CSCC, I'll give you a quick background. The Cloud Standards Customer Council is an end-user advocacy group, and we're chartered to disseminate standards, best practices, and guidance for using cloud computing to solve business challenges. And the program is managed by the Object Management Group, or OMG, which is a not-for-profit technology standards consortium with headquarters here in Needham, Massachusetts. So this year, the Cloud Council is on track to publish 11 new papers and version updates to existing papers, including the practical guide that we'll discuss today. And this work is sent to standards development organizations, open source projects, and across our membership of over 700 member organizations. Majority are cloud customer organizations, consultants, vendors, other SDOs, etc. So this year, if you take a look on this slide, we have the list of papers that we've produced. We've delivered new reference architectures on hybrid cloud integration, API management, securing workloads on cloud services, blockchain, and then papers on data residency, for example, and other topics. So you're welcome to visit our website at cloud-council.org, where we've posted all of these papers, as well as corresponding webinars with authors. And they're freely accessible, open to the public. And if you'd like to join our mailing list, you can become a member. There's also an option to contribute to some of this work. And to do so, you can join one of the working groups that we have up on our site. So I'm joined today by 3 members from the CSCC who helped to lead this paper. There's Bill Van Order, Lockheed Martin Fellow and Steering Committee member of the Cloud Standards Customer Council. Mike Edwards, our resident cloud standards expert, very involved with the CSCC and also ISO working groups, and an IBM Cloud PaaS evangelist. And Carolyn Schock, also from IBM, a cloud and cognitive solutions technical leader, among other recognitions at IBM. So with that, I'm going to hand the presentation over to you, Bill, to get us started. Thanks for speaking today.
Sure. Thank you, Tracy. Appreciate it. My name's Bill Van Order, and I'll be going through the initial sections of this paper and what it outlines, and then be passing the mic over to Mike Edwards and Carolyn Schock. So as Tracy indicated, this is version 3 of our seminal guide, Practical Guide to Cloud Computing. And one of the strengths I see in this paper is that it provides both a comprehensive and actionable set of recommendations for how to implement a cloud computing strategy. I think it explains it in non-technical language for the key concepts about cloud computing that's easily understood to all members of your business community, as well as some recommendation on how to solve discrete enterprise problems using cloud computing technology. And we believe that shares that in 10 clear and easily understood steps that I'll be stepping through along with assistance from Mike and Carolyn. But before I move forward, I would like to acknowledge that besides the folks on this call, a team of industry experts have really had a strong hand in the creation of this document as well as its continued update. And those folks, while too numerous to mention on this webinar, are identified in the acknowledgement section of the paper. So I wanted to give them a shout out because I think we've gotten a group of experts who are able to lend their expertise and lessons learned to this paper. So as Tracy had indicated, this is version 3 of the paper. The first paper was published in 2011. Version 2 was published in April of 2014. And as you might imagine, in the cloud computing industry, it's moving at such a fast pace that a revision of the paper was needed. And the contents of the paper are highlighted in the right section of this slide, stepping through the various steps to highlight specific revision updates that we've made in version 3, as well as updating all sections to reflect the evolution and maturity of both the business and technical aspects of cloud computing. We've made some specific upgrades to various steps and sections of the paper. The essential cloud characteristics section was updated to reflect the latest ISO IAC standards. The cloud deployment model section, step 3, was rewritten completely. Step 5, who will develop, test, deploy, and maintain cloud services, was expanded to include considerations for maintaining cloud services. Step 7, which is the assess and resolve security, privacy, and data residency issues, was expanded to include treatment of data residency issues, which are becoming very important given the data privacy laws and the data sovereignty laws that we're starting to see in the industry today. And then step 9, developing a proof of concept, was revised to add some specific discrete success criteria. And then there's been a number of updates to the references that we'll be stepping through as part of this presentation as well. So, getting into our 10-step process, step 1 is assembling our team for cloud adoption. And as you might imagine, I like to think of good engineering as being a team sport, and I think that applies equally to cloud transformation journeys. And as part of this, we believe that it really requires a full participation by business leadership, IT, and functional orgs supporting the successful cloud adoptions. And senior management leadership is critical to this overall step. We've broken down in the paper the 3 phases of cloud adoption. Phase 1 being the strategic planning process, where business leaders combine together to define what the vision is for your cloud computing journey, whether it's cost competitiveness, agility. It really defines what the value proposition that you're going after in your business. It defines also the terms of reference, given the purpose, the roles and responsibility, and how the actual cloud transformation journey will occur and engagement process undergo. And then it defines also guidelines, which is very much of establishing the business framework and guidelines for how this journey is going to take place within the culture that your corporation may have. And then that's followed by phase 2, which is the workload planning process. As part of this, we see that business analysis is critical. You have to define a business case and an ROI and a way to measure that ROI in your process as you progress through this cloud transformation journey. Also, as part of the workload planning process, we see technical analysis to look at the different technology comparisons that you're going to be looking at for your cloud transformation, and the paper outlines various aspects during these 10 steps. And then, of course, the output of the workload planning process needs to be a transformation roadmap, which identifies some of your critical success factors and how you're going to achieve that. And then the workload planning process is followed by phase 3, which is the operations planning phase. During this, members of your procurement organization are going to get involved in negotiations with cloud service providers. The implementation will discuss how your business processes are going to be impacted during the operations phases, and then the operations will most undecidedly get impacted by this transition to cloud operations with new players, namely your cloud service provider, if you've got one, coming into the forefront of your operations map. So moving on to step 2, which is to develop our business case and enterprise cloud strategy. And one of the things the paper talks about is developing a comprehensive strategic plan that reduces the impacts and helps us facilitate the future decisions for project-specific implementation and adoption. And some of the key elements in strategic planning that we're going to be going through is obviously educating the full team what cloud is and what cloud can bring to bear in terms of solving business problems, as well as what cloud is not. Critical to that is establishing some common terminology and definitions for what you're hoping to achieve, establishing your short and long-term goals, and this will establish your master blueprint that will map the benefits and the business problems to specific cloud use cases that you can deploy and create, hopefully, a phased deployment cloud map. Also, a key element is understanding the required services and functionality. Oftentimes, this differentiates us between customer-facing services from internal IT services in terms of how you might apply cloud computing technology. Executing a thorough cost analysis is also critical, and the paper identifies some specific direct and indirect costs that can be attributed as part of your cloud transformation journey. Understanding and assessing your impact to cloud service levels for all applications that you are targeting for your cloud transformation is another critical aspect, because your operational model will almost certainly change. As part of the strategic plan too, you should also identify your success goals and metrics that allow you to measure your progress. And that's typically as part of a phased cloud adoption strategy. Another thing to consider is your existing IT environment. You may have compliance requirements that you have to adhere to. You also may want to use this as an opportunity to architecturally develop some reusable cloud services to maximize your investment in this new technology. Assessing your cloud operational support model allows you to determine what your new cloud support model is going to be and what tools you'll need in order to support a successful transition into operations. Also key to this is understanding some of the legal and regulatory requirements. You may have to comply with new requirements or new regulations, and your cloud service provider will also have to support certain types of regulatory requirements to host the environment and the applications that you're looking to host. Identifying required skills is probably one of the most critical things and overlooked things that you have in a cloud transformation journey. It's going to affect your IT staffing roles and responsibilities and needs to be carefully crafted along this journey to make sure that your team is outfitted to be successful in this new operational mode. Tracking the results for an extended period of time is a critical element of determining how successful you are in this transformation journey. And should cost implications and cloud adoption not yield the successful results that you're looking for, you need to understand an exit strategy and what that exit strategy may involve prior to jumping into a cloud transformation and decision to move forward. So moving on to step 3 in our plan here, what we're going to do, we recommend looking at your cloud deployment models, and that's going to establish the criteria for selecting what model and cloud deployment option is right for you. One of the things the paper does is establishes a matrix between different types of deployment options, both private cloud, on-site, and outsourced. Hybrid cloud, which is emerging as probably the most prominent type of mode, where you have a mixture of private, public, or community offerings suitable for different types of workloads. And it compares it against a variety of considerations, such as the criticality of your cloud services, allowing you to categorize your cloud applications into various types of criticality models and understand what type of environment's best suited for you, as well as considerations for your types of workload, your migration cost, are you rehosting, you're refactoring, you're rebuilding types of applications, what cloud elasticity is going to do in terms of allowing you to shrink or grow according to different types of demand models. Security threats, understanding the shared responsibility model for a cloud provider to provide security of the cloud versus the customer responsibility of offering security in the cloud. Multi-tenancy and compliance requirements are critical also into the evaluation criteria. Environment portability to avoid vendor lock-in is also critical. And then the impact on your disaster and recovery and failover plans should your cloud experience some sort of outages. And it's pretty much guaranteed in any type of IT environment that outages will occur. It's how you address those, which is going to be a critical aspect. So moving on to step 4, I'll turn the mic over to Mike Edwards from IBM.
Thank you. That's a very good and now, yes, indeed, moving on to step 4. One of the big things that you will need to consider when dealing with cloud computing is which cloud service model you're going to be adopting. So these are broadly characterized as infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. And this diagram gives you the idea of who is responsible for what between the cloud customer on the one side and the cloud provider on the other. And then in infrastructure as a service, you're looking at basic compute facilities, so machines to run stuff on, storage devices to store data on, and networking capabilities to network stuff together. And in that circumstance, you're responsible for typically everything from the operating system level upwards, including any middleware you need, any application stuff. Platform as a service, by contrast, has the cloud service provider take responsibility for the software stack that your application would need. So you'll likely get the operating system, you'll get a middleware layer, you'll get runtimes that your software may need, and so on. And then with software as a service, most of the system will be provided by the provider. So typically that's you're effectively getting a complete application that does some particular capability straight from the vendor. And which you need to take depends on your situation. It's often the case that we would advise small and medium-sized businesses to consider moving directly to a software as a service style of offering, since smaller businesses will often find it harder to have in-house the necessary skills to build and maintain the complete software stack that's required for an application. So it might be a lot easier to just go out to a cloud service provider who has the kind of application you need and just buy the whole thing in. Platform as a service offering, by comparison, is probably a more complex choice. So this is a case where you probably have some custom software of your own that you want to write or you already have and want to run. And you'd prefer to have the hard work of setting up and maintaining the various middleware stacks that you might need, databases, particular kinds of runtime, web servers, you name it. It may be a far better thing again to allow the cloud service provider to provide those important middleware functions off the shelf. They will, for example, if they offer a database type service, they can take care of things like backup, restore, redundancy of configuration so that the database effectively never goes down on you. In comparison with doing all that yourself, it can be a lot easier to allow a cloud service provider to do that for you. Infrastructure service right at the bottom then is obviously the basic compute capabilities. You're effectively buying servers in the cloud, you're buying disks in the cloud, networks, and if you have experience and skill available to manage the whole stack for your applications, then that can be a good cost-effective option for you. And you can get all the benefits of cloud computing by using that layer of infrastructure as a service. That will allow you to get scalable IT capacity. That will be a difference probably from what you might have in your own data center on premises. And it might offer other capabilities as add-on features, which again you wouldn't have to manage yourself. As an example for that, many of the infrastructure service providers will provide important security capabilities, firewalls and such like, that again are already configured by their skilled staff and avoid the need for you to deal in those sorts of components. What we can say over time is that more and more software as a service offerings, complete packages effectively, are becoming available. Cloud computing really started off down at the bottom with infrastructure service and has grown more and more through PaaS and SaaS, and there are some very sophisticated offerings available today for both software as a service and platform as a service. So there are certainly things that you should be aware of and consider when considering moving to use cloud services. Moving on to step 5. The next question is, who in your organization is going to develop, test, deploy and maintain the cloud services that you're going to use? And there are a whole series of questions you need to ask yourself here. So, for example, in the question of who's going to develop and test, do you have good in-house development and deployment skills available to you? Or do you not have those capabilities? Would it be actually better to use development and deployment capabilities that, for example, a cloud provider may have available? Or alternatively, you might look at looking at an independent cloud service development provider. There are plenty of ISVs of that kind out there. Or, as we said, for small and medium-sized enterprise, you may be able to find good software as a service offerings which are effectively off the shelf available from the cloud service provider. And you have to analyze your own organization and their capabilities, skills and experience, and determine where along that line you're sitting and which might be the most suitable, therefore, for your organization. Of course, there are a number of important factors that go along with that. Of course, cost is always a big factor. You've always got to take into account how much it's going to cost to adopt cloud using whichever approach. And the question then is also the responsiveness. How quickly can you get what you need for your business done using whichever of these routes? If you don't have existing skills, it may take quite a time for you to skill up your in-house development organization. Maybe you can get there quicker by buying it in some way. Then there's the question of flexibility. If you need to make changes, how easy is it to do that? And again, that will depend on the kind of application, the kind of capabilities that you need. The more flexibility you need, probably the more likely it is you want to do it in-house, so you can rapidly change the solution as required. And then there's the question of the partnership that you have with any other providers, whether they're the cloud service provider or independent developers. How good a partnership can you establish with those folks to enable you to get the job done? And the considerations that go along with that, of course, then what skills you have, what are the considerations to start up using this new cloud service, and what updates might you need to make to existing applications and services? And have you got the capabilities to do effective testing, deployment, and support of whatever it is that you're using the cloud services to do? Moving on to step 6. One very important aspect is how your organization is going to govern the use you make of cloud services, and how those governance policies you have relate to the cloud service agreements that you will have between your organization and the cloud service provider. Now, you need to take great care over cloud service agreements. You need to look very carefully at the documentation that the cloud service provider makes available to you and compare it with what needs you have, what expectations you have for the service you're buying into, and what governance processes there are that are stated for the cloud service. For example, if an upgrade for maintenance, for example, what kind of notice do you get given? You may ask the question of if there is a security problem, how do they report those things to you, and how do those security problems get resolved? So again, all sorts of factors that you need to build into your consideration of the governance of the cloud services that you're going to use. Now, the practical guide just gives a high-level view of these issues. There is a whole other white paper called the Practical Guide to Cloud Service Level Agreements, which deals with the detail of cloud service agreements and the considerations and processes that you need to follow when looking at those before you sign on the dotted line to buy a service. And you need to be, looking at your policies within your organization for governance, and then the policies of the provider, the kind of culture that you have, the kind of governance processes that you have in-house, and whether you can make those mesh then with the governance processes that your provider will have. You need to have clear metrics and measures relating to the service, and this could be not simply things like availability, which you will always want to know, but things like response times, the ability, for example, to deal with an outage and recover from it. Are they able to meet your targets for doing that? And if there are problems that fall outside the stated service level agreements, what kind of remediation and compensation processes are in place from the cloud service provider to your organization? So things to consider, and the Practical Guide to Cloud SLAs, one white paper, and then the second white paper that also available from CSCC called Public Cloud Service Agreements, What to Expect and What to Negotiate, provides more detail on how to handle the cloud service agreement, how to negotiate with the cloud service provider to get what you need. Moving on to step 7, we then have to concern ourselves with the major issues of security, of privacy, and data residency issues. These are always of big importance. They're important for your in-house IT systems. They're equally as important for any cloud services that you use. Now, again, because it's such an important area of using a cloud service, the CSCC has created a whole separate white paper dealing with the security of cloud computing, called the Security of Cloud Computing 10 Steps to Ensure Success. And again, for the detail of how to manage this, I would emphasize you should go and read that very detailed paper that deals with these things. But the sort of risks that you face if you don't deal with security properly when handling cloud services is as listed here, the sort of loss of governance, because you're not fully in control anymore. You're relying on your cloud service provider to do various things for you. There is a whole question of compliance and legal risk. Your organization probably has various regulations and laws that you have to comply to. Are you sure that the cloud service provider is going to meet those obligations when they run the cloud service on your behalf? And this is no trivial matter. So a lot of people at the moment are worrying about the new data privacy regulation that's coming into force in Europe, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. That places certain specific legal requirements on you if you hold personal data belonging to any European citizen. And if you're putting that data into a cloud service, you need to be sure that the cloud service provider is going to meet the requirements of that regulation also. And you should expect certain specific statements to be made by your cloud service provider about that kind of personal data. But that's just one example amongst a number of regulations that you may have to meet when you use a cloud service. You need to be aware of whether the cloud service provider meets them or not. A big area of concern should always be ambiguity of responsibilities. You as the cloud service customer will have some responsibilities. The cloud service provider will have some responsibilities. And when it comes to security and privacy, knowing exactly who's responsible for what is vital. You should not rely on the cloud service provider doing something unless it's specifically stated that they will. And if you need something doing, you need to be sure whether it's your organization that has to do it or whether the cloud service provider is expected to do it. One interesting thing to worry about in cloud security that may not be obvious at first is the question of data deletion. You're putting potentially sensitive, confidential, personal data belonging to your organization into the cloud service. Can you be sure that when you say you want it deleted, that it really does get deleted? And the issue there is that the cloud service provider may be storing backups of the data, maybe storing redundant copies of data, and that may be all goodness because it's avoiding single points of failure. But when you then say, okay, I want the data deleted, are you sure that all of those copies of the data that the cloud service provider may have, are they all getting deleted? So again, things to be concerned about in managing the security and privacy. You need to be sure of how security incidents are handled. If there is some kind of attack on your system or some kind of incident happens, how is it handled? How is it dealt with? What's the provider going to be doing? How does the provider deal with service unavailability? How do they deal with vulnerabilities of their own interfaces? So cloud services typically not only have functional interfaces, but they have management interfaces that your administrators will want to use to manage the service. Again, that is an open interface that's typically accessed over the internet, so it can be vulnerable to attack by outsiders. And how is that handled? So that deals with step 7. I'll move us forward to step 8 and hand over to Carolyn. Over to you, Carolyn.
Thank you. And Mike, the integration needs, it's a very broad category, and while we've simplified what integration might mean here in this slide to look at data integration, process integration, the management capabilities, etc. Underlying this, there might be complexities of decomposing applications to fit in with the cloud deployment model chosen. You might be seeing containerization, microservices that go along with that. So, really this is the tip of the iceberg. And what has come before in the 10 steps will play into some of these decisions. How you integrate data, where you will place your cloud services are dependent on some of the compliance and data residency concerns. The processes that you put in place are going to be depending on availability, SLAs, a variety of other governance concerns, and possibly also, depending on the applications you're moving to the cloud, your organization will have its own contractual requirements with your customers that will need to come into play. That leads into the management capabilities. If you have more pieces to keep track of and to manage and to assure availability, you will need to make sure that the management capabilities you already have in place are up to the job. So there will be some, as we move ahead, you'll see some need to test this out, to do some proofs of technology. And then once again, the business capabilities. Are the services that you have in place in your enterprise able to report and keep track of these new financial concerns, provide the effective granularity so that you can do internal bill back, so you can break out if in fact you have a charge back to the customer. All of these particular pieces require some care, and if it is possible to make some of these changes incrementally with a smaller set of workloads, you could find yourself better prepared to tweak before doing a major rollout of a new set of cloud services or changes. In step 9, we come to the developing that proof of concept. You could call it a proof of technology. Obviously your team needs to include both the technology folks and, once again, the functional representation. Those operational personnel, business personnel, could be customer service. It can, be a broad swath of persons you might not have considered in your older application and system architecture, because you are very likely going to be having new metrics. You could have new KPIs, both internal and, for some of the external facing. Once again, the organization's customers, if you have applications that face out, into your own business world, you have to consider how they will respond. And with that implementation activities, of course, you're going to be verifying the technical functions. You're going to be assuring that processes, the typical data recovery and backup and all of these things come into play. But you're also going to have to consider what could be new escalation concerns, because things that the help desk will be talking about won't just be your own application necessarily. If you have a complex hybrid architecture, if you have multiple cloud service providers providing data, management tools, your help desk is going to need visibility into that, and is going to need to have scripts and a clear line to escalate problems that they can't solve. They're going to need to know where to go. This proof of concept is the ideal time to go very deeply into the what-ifs and make sure that you have a plan. Make sure that you have access for administrative staff. Make sure that there is clarity about identity and your access management, not just for the immediate need, but also looking beyond. If you are an organization that has, let's say, a lot of merger and acquisition activity, and to this point in time you haven't had a glide path. You might want to be looking at this proof of concept as an opportunity to see how you could make that activity easier with the workloads you're moving to cloud. So this proof of concept is very much an opportunity to not just see that you are doing the fundamentals that you've always done well, simply in a new architecture, but to see that you're covering new territory that you've created by moving these workloads into the cloud. Now, managing the cloud environment, ideally you've been looking at these concerns, not just in step 10, but a consideration from the get-go, because it's going to change things operationally, in IT and in the business. It has broad implications. And you can see from this diagram, depending on how many different cloud services you've chosen, that the line of responsibility falls in a different area. For that small business that was mentioned early on, that perhaps has moved the bulk of their systems into a software as a service model, they're going to be concerned with business processes. They will very likely also have some concern for provisioning users. Perhaps there's single sign-on that they will work out with another provider. So it's focused on that privacy, on some data, their own data compliance, assuring that their providers meet those expectations. In the platform as a service, of course, there is a broader swath of hands-on responsibilities. In this case, the customer themselves is responsible for the data privacy. They're not simply checking to assure that the contractual obligations are met. They have to make sure that they are meeting the needs. They are creating the applications. They have the business process. And so down to the infrastructure as a service, where the customer is responsible from the operating system up. And you're going to need to harmonize all of these responsibilities if you have a hybrid model for your cloud transformation chosen. And that is the majority of customers these days will have a hybrid environment. It's very rare to see a customer who has only one cloud service provider or doesn't have some traditional on-premise systems in addition to the ISPs. Those SLA processes are also key, and the handoffs in between and the escalations paths. Working through those, having those discussions, modeling and doing what-ifs will be very important. If you're an organization that has managed to avoid drills for things like business continuity up to this point in your existence, it is time to think about those. Moving to the cloud typically simplifies all of that and makes it less likely that you won't have continuity. But if you do have multiple services and multiple providers, it will be important that you have the escalation points and escalation paths well identified, that you know what will happen in a critical situation, and that you've chosen providers who could meet those particular needs. And for both your service providers and your own customers and your internal services, those metrics really are important. As I mentioned earlier, you might have new KPIs. you might begin measuring things in a different way. You're probably going to need to adapt and evolve some of these metrics as you add and subtract services. So don't wait until the last minute. Begin to discuss those, use the proof of concept as a means to see what you might change in what you're measuring, and also what new metrics you might have available to you. A good example is in the application, the platform as a service space. The way, if you're adopting, for example, DevOps or continuous delivery, you're probably not going to be only measuring defects in an application. It's going to be a time to test, a time to availability. It's the velocity of the changes as well as the quality in that case.
And there you have it.
So we do have it.
Thank you, Carolyn. This is Tracy again.
You, Tracy.
Excellent. I'll go ahead and, there we are. Thank you, Carolyn, Mike, and Bill. To everyone still tuned in, we have some time for Q&A. We do have a question that's come in. So if you have some things on your mind, feel free to enter them. We have a good 10-15 minutes. And while I have you here, a few calls to action. If you're interested, you're very welcome to join the Cloud Standards Customer Council if you have not yet already, and to have an impact on customer use case-based standards requirements, to learn all about cloud standards within one organization, and to help define our roadmap heading into 2018 and beyond. We're starting to look at that with our steering committee in terms of topic coverage for next year. So if you're interested in being a contributor to the CSCC's content, we have a link here for joining a working group. We have 4 different working groups. There's the Practical Guide to Cloud Computing, we have a security working group, a big data working group, and a XAAS working group. And then the last link on this slide, the Resource Hub. This is where we post all of the CSCC's papers, including version 3 of the Practical Guide to Cloud Computing. In this next slide here, we've pulled out, there are plenty of references within the Practical Guide to Cloud Computing, pointing back to other topical papers. So here are some, but the Resource Hub contains all of them for your reading pleasure. So now let's take a couple of questions. Let's see. First question is, the cloud service model that was presented seems based on legacy N-tier / layered architecture. Containers remove the OS layer. Serverless does not require the middleware layer. The flexibility of Lambda microservice APIs do not need the application layer. With the integration of disaster recovery as a service and the rise of integration and performance management, will there be a next version to include all of these? Bill, perhaps you would like to take a stab at this question.
Sure. And then Mike and Carolyn, please feel free to jump in. So one of the things that was a primary incentive for us in this version 3 was to include some of the new technologies that are starting to really take over in the cloud computing environment. So we have, given the fact that this is a high-level paper, we wanted to keep it primarily non-technical. We are and have included sections that reference serverless computing technology a la AWS Lambda and microservices-based architectures, as well as some discussion of Docker containers and container technology generally. I would point out that in the next couple of weeks, and Tracy, you and Mike probably have a better date than I do, in the next couple of weeks I believe the CSCC is going to be releasing the next version of the interoperability and portability for cloud computing guide, and there's some further discussion about things like how container technology and some of these other services are weighing into the interoperability and portability considerations.
Yeah, if I could take that a little bit further, Mike Edwards here. The technologies like serverless, like containers, actually don't get rid of the distinctions. It's still a question of what it is that's being provided by the target cloud service that you're looking at. So one way to look at serverless is just a more sophisticated version of a runtime for running the content of your application. But your application may still have all kinds of dependencies that will still need to be managed. Serverless doesn't get rid of the potential need for a database, for example. So somewhere in the system there's going to be a database if you're going to need to store data. And the basic options you have is still you provide it yourself using an infrastructure of a service type system, or do you have it provided for you by the cloud service provider in a platform fashion. So the fundamental ideas don't really change even though the technologies are newer. Yes, containers are great technology, serverless are great technology, and you should consider using them for sure. But of course, those considerations of which of the technologies you use are more about, well, how should I build a particular solution when using cloud computing, which is a slightly different topic than we have here today, and there are all kinds of technical issues to consider.
Mike, I would add to that, this is Carolyn Chalk, I would add to that a group that is going heavily towards a microservices container architecture and a transformation for all of their apps is going to add some governance complexity to what they might already have. You can't start you have to come up with decisions about what becomes a microservice and what doesn't, because if you have hundreds of microservices, that's a lot to manage. So, you know, there are lots of details that need to come into play, and as you said, the other concerns don't disappear. They still need to be taken into account.
Thanks, Carolyn. Next question that's come in is asking if you could please comment on the use of ITIL and CMDBs for cloud-based solutions.
Hey, Tracy, this is Bill. I can jump in first with an initial response. You know, I think that ITIL processes are still applicable to cloud-based solutions, and obviously, you know, ITIL involves a number of the service operations capabilities that, you know, cloud services will need to obviously factor into. The use of CMDBs for cloud-based solutions, I think that most predominantly weighs in the area of cloud management platforms, and the CSCC recently this year put together a practical guide for cloud management platforms that, you know, talk about how some vendors are starting to weave into their cloud management platforms the concept of a configuration management database for capturing some of the information and managing within a heterogeneous mix of cloud environments.
Thanks, Bill. Any other comments?
No, I think Bill has it. We have the other white paper which he talked about, and that gets into a lot of the details about how you might manage your cloud services using tooling, and it's well worth taking a read of that paper.
Thanks, Mike. Next question. From your experience, can you speak to the importance of getting the business culture aligned to a cloud transformation effort, and what steps you'd recommend to initiate these cultural changes? So, culture question. I can repeat this if you'd like.
think we're all thinking quietly here. So I'll start off. I think my comment would be that yes, preparing the way for the use of cloud services is a big aspect of being successful. Some organizations are somewhat naturally conservative and not overly keen to start using services such as cloud services. And you really have to get the business and the culture right in order to be successful use of cloud services. It shouldn't be underestimated. I don't think there's a magic formula, as with any business transformation, but the very fact is that there are now many organizations out there who have successfully implemented cloud computing in one form or another and are getting significant benefits from doing so. So that ought to help point the way to help you get your organization transformed and culturally accepting the changes that cloud computing will bring.
Yeah, and this is Bill. Just to add to Mike's comments, I think culture for cloud computing is naturally also aligned with the cultural shift that we're starting to see with DevOps or DevSecOps types of environments. And cloud computing can obviously bring in that direct control and agility that can be complementary to a cultural shift to start looking at DevOps types of processes too. So I think that they can go hand in hand as complementary process changes and cultural changes.
Yeah, Mike, go ahead, Karen.
Oh no, I'm sorry. It was Tracy. I was going to maybe sneak in one last question before we close, but I didn't.
Oh, go ahead then. Go and sneak.
This final question relating to the upcoming GDPR legislation. How may my cloud strategy be impacted by the upcoming GDPR legislation in the EU?
Okay, let me deal with that, because that's unfortunately my bread and butter. I was in Brussels last week dealing with some of the fallout from it. So privacy regulations generally around the world are getting more strict, more tough, because of the problems that people have had. Not typically with cloud services on it, but just generally data loss of personal data has been a big deal. So in Europe there is a specific regulation which comes in May next year, which any organization that deals in personal data will have to meet. That's causing many organizations to put in special programs for what they're going to do to meet the requirements of the regulation. And that's equally true of cloud service providers for those services where you're going to store personal data. So at this stage, in the run-up to the new regulation, you need to be talking with your cloud service provider if you're going to store personal data in one or more cloud services, and you need to be getting an understanding from them that they will meet their side of the obligations that the regulations have. But you should understand that if you gather personal data that it, gathering on your customers or your employees, whatever, as a cloud service customer, the ultimate responsibility is still on you to make sure the right things happen with that data. So you're looking for assurances from the provider, but the real regulatory burden is still sitting on your shoulders. That doesn't go away.
Yeah, and I think that all I would add to it is, like any kind of new compliance, it seems daunting and it seems much more complicated than it is. So allowing time to be thoughtful and to deal with what is in fact the tedium of reviewing will allow for a less stressful and more successful outcome.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks to everyone tuning in today. As mentioned earlier, we have a couple other papers that we're targeting over the next week or so with webinars coming in January. There'll be version 2.0 of our interoperability and portability guide, and now version 3.0 of our security for cloud computing 10 steps to ensure success. So keep your eyes out for those, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Happy holidays to everyone, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.